The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
And you're gonna love it.
Okay, let's go.
Well, it is totally good to see you again. And, what's crazy is when you sent me that, "Hey, let's talk about World War II, it really was like in my mind because all of the sudden World War II is like back in the press. And there's a guy, Daryl Cooper, he's gone on Joe Rogan, he's gone on Tucker Carlson. So those guys have Daryl Cooper, and I've got my own historian, Christine Lynn. So, hey, it's great to have you back. I really do appreciate it. I've continued to get a lot of great comments and feedback on the episode we did on Russia together. And so today, listen, everybody, this is actually going to be incredibly knowledgeable for everybody, including myself, because honestly, I just don't think most Americans truly have any real clue. We don't have any real memory of what the heck World War II was about. And considering every other day we're seeing in the news that, hey, we're on the brink of World War III, I think it makes a lot of sense to take a deep dive back into World War II with Christine. And I'll start off by asking you this. So World War II was called the Good War. Why is that? And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be with you again, Ray. The Good War. Well, that is American jingoism. And as you just alluded to, the World War II time period is something most Americans, what they think they know is false. And that is, again, due to so many years of what I call dark myths and outright lying propaganda that has been perpetrated, again, for the agenda of the imperialist United States. The Good War. Now, I'm going to think about that. That's what Americans call it. I think about the bombing of Dresden and hundreds of other German cities. Churchill targeted civilians purposefully. I think about Truman dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Unjustified, unnecessary. I think about the German siege of Leningrad and the starvation. Over 1.5 million civilians, Soviets, died. Massive suffering. We think about the work camps, the concentration camps, and certainly most of all, I think about those who suffered and died the most. The Soviet Union lost some 27 million people because of this. I'd like to ask, what is good about all that human death and suffering? But the Americans call it the Good War. Again, jingoism. It was good for them. They only lost, and all life lost during this is tragic, but they only lost about 400,000. Again, think about the Soviets, 27 million lost. China, millions lost. Europe, devastated. But the Americans call it the Good War because it ended with them becoming a superpower. It was good for them economically. It's good for an imperialist power such as the United States. And only an evil nation, and I am sad to have to say that about my own country, but it would only be an evil nation that would call that tragic and unnecessary loss of life good. That's the United States for you.
Yeah. And, again, I mean, we talked about it in the last episode, and I've talked about it in practically every episode. It's the people in power at that time. And I think for the United States, it was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then into Truman. And we'll talk about those guys in a second. Let me ask you this question on Dresden, on the bombing of Dresden and then Churchill. It's interesting because you hear about that a lot. And ironically, you've heard about that as a justification by Benjamin Netanyahu for what he's doing in Gaza. And like the past 18 months, I can't tell you how many times I've heard Israeli government officials almost say, well, you guys did it in Dresden to, anyone English that brings it up. And they literally say, well, what's the difference with that and what we're doing? Explain that whole Dresden situation. And again, that was done by Churchill, who has been applauded as a hero, but I don't know. I feel like everybody's peeling back the onion on everything these days, and they're calling into question everything. So, can you help us understand the Dresden thing for a second before we move on?
Yes, and it will lead me to what I want to share with you about Churchill. Of course, they're going to equate that. They are of the same mindset. Human life means nothing to that human demon, Netanyahu, just as human life meant nothing to Churchill. And frankly, I believe that Churchill is one of the most evil individuals that have ever lived historically. I do not believe that World War II, the escalation to an intercontinental war as it became, would have occurred had it not been for Churchill. Frankly, in terms of an individual, everybody looks to and cites Hitler. We are always going to have those who may start out with a good cause, but because of their own egotistical aims and an evil aim, go beyond what was right to do. We're always going to have individuals like that. But when we look at a power such as Churchill had with Britain and the United States, it did not have to escalate. And frankly, I do not believe we would have had the massive loss of life if not for Winston Churchill. In terms of Dresden, you asked about that specifically. As I said, of course they're going to equate it because they both have the same values. Human life means nothing to the government of that Zionist state, just as human life meant nothing to Britain, its government at the time. And frankly, I will add this, nor does it mean anything to the US government at this time. Dresden, sadly, was just one of hundreds of cities. Certainly, it is the one most people are aware of. But when I went back and read, and I've read many of the documents and the correspondences between Churchill and the generals and the books that were written thereafter, Churchill got glee out of attacking the civilians of Germany. It was purposeful. And it's really that it points to how we began this, the lies and dark myths that people believe to consider him a good statesman when he was evil to the core, as far as I am concerned, just like Netanyahu is. So yes, certainly they would equate it, and the Americans certainly have nothing to say about it. And obviously they're funding it and providing the weapons. It's all just theater between themselves to justify their evil.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's lay the timeline because again, I mean, I think most people just have no clue. And correct me if I'm wrong. From what I saw, World War II started in 1933, I think, and it lasted until 1945. Is that right? Is that accurate as far as the dates?
Well, I would always place it at 33 because that was actually the year that the international Jewry declared financial war against Germany. Everything else that came thereafter was a result of, and when we say international Jewry, I am referring to they basically controlled much of the banking, the lending. They were a part, the Zionists were a part of actually the formation of the Versailles Treaty, which just devastated. You think about how devastated Germany already was, but financially, the starvation that occurred after that, the blockade of their borders, their inability to import and export, which they needed for food, all of that was Zionist planned. Then in 1933, long before any persecution within Germany of the Jewish people that were there, they declared, and I will tell you why. In my study, where we're talking about the American Jewish Congress, the International Jewish Congress, there were quite a number of Jewish organizations worldwide, and it made headlines across the world, Ray, that international Jewry had declared war on Germany. It was a financial war. And that blockade at that time, I feel, based upon my research, was done because Germany was doing so well. Remember, Germany suffering after the Versailles Treaty. Hitler, in approximately 4 years, brought Germany from being one of the poorest nations, if not the poorest in Europe, to one of the wealthiest. It was flourishing. And what did he do? He proved that they could make their own currency. They were not reliant upon the Federal Reserve banks and the lending and all of that. And for the bankers, which were heavily controlled by the Jews, economically, they wanted to keep Germany subservient to the Versailles Treaty. And once that was done, I will remind people, in Madison Square Garden, for example, over 40,000 came out in the Jewish protest against Germany, again, before any persecution and mistreatment of Jews began in Germany. And this really disturbed the Germans, disturbed Hitler, and they did look to Hitler for a way out. So they were certainly a part of it from the very beginning. And of course, they got their Zionist state out of all this. And I would say they had much influence both with Roosevelt and with Churchill. And as a group, I will tell you that I feel international Jewry is most responsible for World War II because of their financial attacks upon Germany, which were substantial, which could bring starvation to Germany again. And as an individual, as I said, I believe Winston Churchill, because he had numerous times to be able to put a stop to this, to make a block of nations, as Stalin repeatedly tried to make the European nations come together to stop that aggression. But at all times, they were rejected. And I believe that's entirely because the US and the UK wanted Germany. They were encouraging them to move eastward to attack the Soviets. They hated both of them and they wanted them to fight.
Okay, okay, yeah, I'll get into that in a second. Let me ask you this, the Versailles Treaty, that came out of World War I. Can you just really quick explain that so we understand that?
Well, and as I said, the Zionists were a major part of the Versailles Treaty Peace Conference, and they made it to their advantage in order to the reparations that Germany had to pay to the nations was enormous. It was egregious. There was nothing just about it. It was meant to punish. And in a war, that is never justified. Afterwards, the enemy has been vanquished. You don't continue to vanquish them and keep them from being able to live their life and prosper again. You simply want to keep them from being a military threat. It went far beyond that. And I would liken it to what we see today. You saw Germany once again, to whatever degree it could. It's tragic when you think about, I always think about the tragic and evil mistake Hitler made by invading the Soviet Union. Because up until then, if it had stopped, and I believe it could have been stopped, Hitler, I would share with you, did not want war with Great Britain. He did not want war. He tried numerous times, but of course that was rejected. Stalin did not want war. The last thing the Soviet Union wanted war with Germany. And yet that was exactly the plan of Churchill and the United States, and certainly the Zionists working behind the scenes. And I don't say that in some type of when you talk about the Zionists and their plans, the fact is they were controlling the banking. They knew that with hurting Germany that bad with the Versailles Treaty, there were going to be the loans. Yes, disproportionately, that was their area, and they wanted to keep Germany down. And every time Germany started to rise, they did it again. So you were left with a country that was desperate, and Hitler promised them a way out.
Okay, I get that. Okay, so the Versailles Treaty really seems like it crippled Germany and made them desperate, and that was coming out of World War I. So then, most people, when they think, okay, what started World War II, they say Hitler invaded Poland. Can you, and again, trust me, I get it. I get it. Like, I don't look at anything on the surface anymore, but can you help us understand maybe why that is considered the start of World War II and what that was all about? And then from there, what was the alignment? Like, what countries then, I guess, came to go against Germany, and what were the teams, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I would like to address it. This is one of the most darkest lies that are told now. And when I think about World War II, and I think particularly about the Soviet loss, No, in the Bible it says no greater love has one for another than to give their life. I think about all of those who gave their lives to defend the motherland. And then I look at what the United States and Europe is now saying was the cause of World War II. And I find it disgusting. Most often, they are now trying to equate the Soviet Union and Germany on equal terms for causing it. And nothing could be more disgusting, dark lie than that. On the contrary, Stalin in the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact that many want to now say was the cause of it. No, that was justified and probably one of the wisest things Stalin did. Prior to that, and to your question, is the other countries, be it Italy, France, the UK, had engaged in numerous pacts with Hitler. Many of them. I would, from my memory, say probably 7 or 8 of them. And yet they always want to point at the one that was done last, that Stalin had to do just to give themselves more time once he realized that that Stalin was going to be fighting the Germans one-on-one. When it came to that, despite all of his trying, he knew that. But I would say the key instigator at the time was the Munich Pact. And that was between the UK and France and Italy. And this is in regards to Czechoslovakia. And they betrayed Czechoslovakia. Those nations had agreed to always defend Czechoslovakia. They essentially just handed Czechoslovakia over to Hitler. Once he had the Sudetenland, and I will even say this, in terms of the Sudetenland and the mistreatment of Germans in those lands that were rightfully German, the Versailles Treaty, the evil of that took away those lands, really did need to be with Germany. Germans were being persecuted and killed in those lands. But they betrayed Czechoslovakia, and Poland got its piece out of Czechoslovakia as well. It was not some passive part of this. But in terms of, they basically handed this over because this emboldened Hitler. This gave him from Czechoslovakia great weaponry. And it was obviously assumed that he is going to then go into Poland. It was not because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, we would say, with the Soviets. That was done out of desperation, and you could see it was inevitable. And Stalin gave himself some more time, who wouldn't, in order to prepare, because he saw very clearly, and no matter how you look at all of the communications at the time, Churchill's plan was to move Hitler into Poland and then to attack the Soviet Union. So I would say it was all planned and encouraged, and anyone is to blame. I'd have to say most of that lies upon Britain. This was their plan, and they achieved it.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. So then Hitler did though invade Poland, and is that when England, Great Britain, and then
No,
France came in?
not exactly. 17 days later, due to the pact that had been made with the Soviet Union, the Polish government had exited. Soviet Union certainly was going to take their buffer zone in that part of Poland. But at that time, that's when they declared war upon Germany, when England declared war upon Germany, but they didn't raise a finger. They didn't do anything because, again, they wanted it to continue to progress where it would be between the Germans and Soviets. So it was quite some time later before they declared war, but before they actually engaged.
Okay. So you're saying it was almost like Churchill and England was trying to bait Hitler versus Stalin, correct? They
It
wanted
was.
that to happen?
It most certainly was. And Stalin knew it. When you read the papers and the meetings with his generals, they were aware of what was going on. And when I talk about, how much Hitler did not want war with England, let's go to that. Something people don't know. He repeatedly, in fact, it's very sad, he thought so much of the British people to his detriment that he even let them escape at Dunkirk. That was not some heroic and wonderful, miraculous. Hitler himself let let them escape. He felt so well toward the British people. And of course, he would come to regret that. He had the power at one time and did nothing that he could have in regards to Britain. But no, they most certainly, and I'm going to go back to what we were discussing earlier. The core of this was to get, in terms of the UK and also the United States, and the Zionist interest was to get the Germans to attack the Soviet Union. Both of them, all of these other allies, if you can call them that, were plotting against the Soviet Union, and they felt the more that they died and the more the Germans died, the better. And of course, in the end, the U.S. comes in at the very end in order to get its vassal states. But they are not the ones who lost. And I would say, I told you earlier about the currency that Hitler, he was thriving in that country. And that was something the Zionists could not accept. And in the Soviet Union, things were changing. Stalin was now, his power was increasing versus the early, or we call them the old Bolsheviks. And they were the Trotskyists. That would really be the Jewish element. And they were losing power completely there. In fact, Stalin was seeing the evil that was being done by them in his country. So they were now unhappy with the leadership of the Soviet Union. Certainly, they were unhappy with the German leadership because they were thriving economically without them. And they won it, and they did masterfully have those two fight. And that is the tragedy of it all. It was preventable, and Churchill could have prevented it. And I would tell you, there were numerous. I've read the correspondences from Stalin to Churchill, and he could never grasp why they would not open another front and why they delayed. But of course, he understood. He, as I said, began to understand they wanted him to face Germany one-on-one, and they had to.
Okay. So like in early 30s, 30, 31, 32, before it technically started, what was the relationship between Stalin and the Soviet Union and then Hitler and Germany? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it indifferent?
It's a great question. Prior to that time, the Soviet Union was helping Germany. Remember, the Soviet Union was an outcast after the revolution and after the communist government was installed. They were an outcast in the world and not even recognized by a lot of nations in the world. Germany was as well after the Versailles Treaty. And the Soviet Union was actually helping Germany in ways that they could not develop in their own countries. There were factories in the Soviet Union for the Germans. The Germans were allowed to come into the Soviet Union, build weapons, of all things, train their military, because no other nation would allow that. There was also ample trade. In fact, on the date of Operation Barbarossa, when Germany invaded, sadly, the Soviet Union had much oil supplies entering Germany at that time. Trade was good, everything was well, which points to the fact that the Soviet Union never intended and most certainly did everything within its power to avoid this war. And that's the tragic step that Hitler took. Without regard to everything else that had come before, it did not have to escalate to what it did, except for the British.
Okay, okay. And at that point, Stalin and the Soviet Union, can you just define, like when you say the Bolsheviks, who were those people? What were those? And then Trotsky, again, these are names I've heard, but like, I want to understand them. And really, I guess where my question is going is at the time before the war started, was Stalin pro or anti-Zionist and Jewish? And then I imagine Hitler, well, actually, was Hitler pro or anti-Zionist Jewish? Like I'm trying to understand where everyone's head was before it started, because I do, even without knowing, I totally already can see that it was probably Churchill who kind of was the puppet master trying to get these guys to fight each other. And I do think Churchill was absolutely pro-Zionist for sure.
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
You are right that he has said that. I remember several of his quotes where he proudly declared his alliance with the Zionists. All right, so That was a multi-question, so I
I
jotted
know,
some
I'm
notes from
sorry.
what you asked. So if I omit one, remind me. What was the status of the Soviet Union at the time? At the time, Soviet Union was doing incredibly well. Stalin had begun what is called his 5-year plans. Industrialization, literacy. He had brought the country from the most illiterate nation in Europe to the most literate. The agriculture was doing much better. And of course, this was an area, that whole part of Europe, that suffered frequently from, crop losses. And his plans were actually raising the standard of living. The medical care was excellent. I mean, excellent in view of what it was before Stalin began to improve it, even in the rural areas. So the literacy rate went up. He felt that everyone should have an education. So the entire society was actually doing very well and had no hostilities toward Germany. In fact, as I said, was helping within. And this is a part that I'm glad you asked. Americans don't understand. They grouped communists together, the Bolsheviks together, the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, that was led by Lenin and overthrew the Tsardom that had been there. And of course, with the tragic loss, unnecessarily, the murder of the family. But in terms of the abdication of the throne of the Tsar, we had an interim government and then the Bolsheviks took over. People sometimes blame that all on the Jewish part of the Bolsheviks, but it was a mix. The Soviet people were multi ethnic, and they certainly had no, I would say, as a people at all, against the Jewish people at all. It's always been multi ethnic, and that respect has always remained there. But at the time, there was a division in the Soviet Union between the Bolsheviks. You could already see what was later to become that division. Trotsky was a Bolshevik that wanted world revolution. And frankly, I believe him to be a madman. He would join with anyone. He would join even with the enemy in terms of at the time when Germany was later fighting the Soviet Union. He would join with anyone in the world and was heavily financed, again, from the United States as well, to go against the Stalin government. And I would have to say Stalin's leadership, what people think of Stalin, almost everything they think they know is false. And I've read the declassified CIA documents in which they said, and this comes later, after the end of World War II, that the CIA wanted the American people and the people of Europe and even the Soviets themselves, the younger generations that have come thereafter, to have a completely false view of who Stalin was and what he did. No, I would say that he was ruthless. He did what he had to do to protect the Soviet Union, but the millions of deaths attributed to him are completely lies, no matter what aspect you come from. And I have studied it both practically and also in the documentation. And that was, we can get to that later. But no, there was nothing anti Jewish at the time, but there were divisions among the Bolsheviks. And you can't just say the communists and the Bolsheviks, because there's a huge line of difference between Stalin, traditional values. I mean, he really was against abortion, wanted the health care, the lifespan went up, the infant mortality rate went down. He was focused upon the people. I would say Trotsky was a man who wanted the power, lost the power, and never let it go until his death. In terms of Hitler, you asked about in regards to the Zionist. I would say, it's interesting. There was a lot of investment in Germany. I don't feel at all that they controlled him, as some people allude to, but there was a lot of investment there in terms of the money. Both countries, for that matter, they were involved worldwide. But again, I point out, I would say that there was no better place on earth as a Jew to live than in Germany pre-World War II. And they had a great standard of living. They had many businesses. So for them to declare financial war worldwide against Hitler made no sense. And that is because the international Jewry cared nothing about the people who would suffer in that country, because still there's big money to be made. Perhaps that answers your question. If not,
Yeah, that totally does. No, that totally does. Let me ask something. When you're saying international jewelry, how do you spell that? G, G,
Jewry, the Jews.
okay.
And there
Okay. Got
are,
it. Got it.
and when I say that as one term because we have so many of their organizations. We have the International Jewish Congress, we have the American Jewish Congress.
Right.
There are many organizations. They all bound together at the time and made a economic blockade of Germany so that nowhere in the world could you buy German goods, and you certainly do not sell to Germany. And that could have been devastating. That could have been brought on the starvation that they had suffered right after the Versailles Treaty. And no,
Okay.
the German people cannot accept that. And it's just very sad. I would say it's tragic to see that they encourage this loss of life for Germany to invade the Soviet Union. They really would help either side. Frankly, the U.S. corporations would help either side whenever they saw one prevailing because they wanted as many Germans and certainly as many Soviets, who was their prime enemy, to die and to weaken that country as possible. And that is diabolical. That is evil. But that's how
No,
it
that
came about.
definitely is.
It's disgusting.
Okay, okay. All right. So before I get into your feelings on something which I really want to ask you, I just want to lay that lens. So we've got England, France, who else was England and France, and then
Well, the Munich Pact involved
I
Italy
want
at
to
the time.
understand I want to understand what countries are on this team, what countries are on this team. Because at this point
Ultimately,
when the war
ultimately,
started, the United States didn't even come in until a little later.
no, very much later. Let's wait until 44. No, what it ended up, of course, being was the Soviet Union and Britain and the United States as the three central powers there. The other nations just turned over into Germany. There was very little resistance, actually. And I believe that it was the Munich Pact that allowed Germany and the betrayal of Czechoslovakia by the British and by France that they knew would result in this result of the Germans invading the Soviet Union. So you had those powers, but it took till the very end before Britain and most certainly the United States began. And don't you ever believe that the United States entered World War II because of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Americans did not want to enter World War II whatsoever. Roosevelt ran on that. Our boys are never going to be in a foreign war. No, I believe from everything that I've read, he knew full well that they were going to enter it. Wait as long as possible. Churchill's influence, and again, it goes back to the Zionist influence on both of those men when you take a look at the financing. But the United States provoked Japan to no end, both
Right, right.
economically and militarily on the seas. Long before then, even one of Roosevelt's advisors, military advisors, later in one of the books that I read, had talked about their discussions. He was just waiting. If we just get a provocation, they need to fire the first shot, so to speak. And it was
Yeah.
completely provoked.
No, there's a lot of talk
There's a
right
lot.
now on false flags and the concept of false flags. And I mean, that term's been around for a while, but I don't think a lot of people have understood it. And I know Pearl Harbor is definitely one of the case studies on false flags and, provocation in order to be able to then do what you want. 9/11 being another. October 7th with Gaza being another. But anyway, we might have to do another episode on all those. All right, let me ask you this. So May 9th, I know May 9th was the 80th anniversary of, I believe, the end of World War II. So give us your personal feelings on that.
Wow. What I did actually was I have immense gratitude to the Soviet people, so much respect for the suffering and the loss that they went through. Every year I watch the live victory day from Moscow. I stay up very late, wee hours of the morning, as they say, to watch the live feed. And thereafter, I watch the ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown. And to me, I just think of the gratitude I have to those people because of their loss. They lost the most and they won the war against fascism. They defeated fascism at the time. It, of course, was not destroyed as we see what's going on in Ukraine now. Nevertheless, they defeated it at the time, and they are the reason that the Germans were defeated. And that leads me, my respect for them, my love for them, and the loss. Not a family was left untouched. Not a family in Russia today is left untouched because they all have loss of life. And the worst, the bombings, I think it was something like, I don't know, 1,700 cities in the Soviet Union destroyed. Like I said, 27 million lost. Of that, 17 million civilians. So you see, today when I
27 million
million,
loss of life.
and that brings me to the disgust that I have for the United States government, Trump, and Europe right now for their dismissal, their disregard, and their persecution, and their lying tongues to ever act as if they, the United States, won the war. That is disgusting. Talk about the revisionism of history. It's been going on, though, Ray, for several years. I've gone back and listened to past presidents, and the minimization or complete lack of even citing the Soviet, what they gave, certainly the minimizing, has been going on in Europe and the United States for quite a number of years now. It's just now reached its apex with the president. I read what Trump's declaration for his victory day and trying to take all the glory. I just find that egotism and that arrogance disgusting, but it's nothing new. It's just blatant now for the American people to see. And it's very sad because, they've done polls where many Americans and many Europeans do not even realize that the Soviets were our allies, or we might better phrase it, we were the allies of them. They are the ones who won the war, and the input of Americans in lives and equipment was minimal.
Yeah, no, totally. I don't think, again, this is why talking about World War II is so interesting, because I don't even think most Americans realize that in World War II, technically, America and England and the Soviets were on the same team. And quite frankly, it was the Soviets that did all the heavy lifting. Okay, let me ask you this. Who was responsible for igniting World War II and why?
Well, it goes back to what I was telling you earlier. I do believe it was the international Jewish organizations, and they benefited great economically, which in turn means the United States and the UK benefited greatly. And the single most individual, not Hitler, no, Churchill. And at all times, that evil man, his plotting, as well as with the United States against the Soviet Union, anything. Human life means nothing to them. Anything in order to eventually be able to attack the Soviet Union and divide it. I remind your audience, or share with them, at the end of World War II, well, even prior to the end of World War II, Churchill was in communication with the United States, urging them to drop atomic bombs upon cities in the Soviet Union. He said, now's our chance. That's how evil the man was. So, of course, the evil that Hitler did, sadly, the mistake of attacking the Soviet Union, which again was preventable. But I would say that the one who had the power to keep it as an individual from happening was Churchill. And of course, his plan, what he wanted was for the tragedy that happened to occur. I would say those two. It's always about money for Britain. Disgusting. It's just a disgusting government. It was then, it is now, and same with the United States. Their hegemony and their economic power is what is most important to them. It was then, and it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I know with World War II in particular, there were a ton of prisoners of war. What happened to all those people?
Well, that brings up another dark myth, a lie that people believe. Goebbels in Germany was an excellent propagandist, And he had made the German people, both the civilians,
And by the way, Goebbels was that like Hitler's number 2 guy or like
minister of
his
propaganda.
lieutenant?
He was the minister of
Okay.
propaganda, and he was excellent at what he did. And I've taken a look at what was printed in the magazines and the papers and the posters in Germany to completely make them fear the Soviets. The civilians feared the Soviets, thinking that, you know, if they came into a town, that there was going to be mass murders and mass rapes. And even the soldiers, the German soldiers fighting, had been given this lying propaganda about the Soviet troops. And thus, as they were being defeated, everybody thought it was better to surrender to the Americans. Big mistake. Big mistake. Talking about the prisoners of war, something I think Americans should be aware of. There is the Rhine Meadow camps. I believe it was about 17 concentration camps that the United States set up for hundreds of thousands, millions of German prisoners of war. And these camps were, in my opinion, based upon all of the research, I've read the testimonials of those who survived. I've read the testimonials from American soldiers who were guards at these camps. And I have come to the conclusion, based on much study, that it was intentionally that the German prisoners of war were kept in such deprivation, no shelter whatsoever, just giant camps on the land, massive mud, massive disease, and they were starved to death. And some people like to refer to these, you know, because Eisenhower was the head of the U.S. military at the time, operations. They call them Eisenhower camps. Well, what I will say, I don't know whether the buck stops at Eisenhower or does it go to the general chiefs of staff. But what I do know is it was systematic. It was not an exception. And I've read plenty of Americans who also shared where there would be so much food and they would not give it to them. They died by the thousands and thousands. Some estimates put it up to 1 million. I don't know. Certainly we could go into the thousands or tens of thousands of Germans needlessly died. And there was plenty of food at the camps. I remember one, in fact,
Where are these camps? These camps you're
these are
talking
along
about?
the
What?
Rhine. They're the Rhine Meadow camps. They were put along the river and built
I don't know.
by the
Where is
Americans
that?
in
What country are we talking?
Germany, but they
Germany.
had camps elsewhere as well. France also had their camps and did their mistreatment as well of the Germans. I would tell you that the Germans were not treated according to international law. And in fact, it was signed before, right at the end of the war. Eisenhower signed it so that he would not call them prisoners of war and get out of that caveat so that the Red Cross would not be able to visit. There were occasional Americans in authority who came there. Red Cross was not able to visit them, who was able to come there and at that time bring in food. By the way, I would tell you that civilians or American soldiers who tried to give food to them would be killed. They would be shot if they at all. And villagers, Germans, and this is all in Germany, German civilians, women would bring food that they wanted to give the prisoners. They would be shot if they were caught. Sometimes they would be confiscated and they would burn the food in front of the people. We are talking about tens of thousands of suffering men because the United States wanted to inflict this evil retribution upon them. And again, the same with the rape stories, completely fabricated where they blame the Soviets. Now, sadly, in all wars, such evil does happen. You cannot control everybody. But there was also a very big difference in what I have read. There were those women with young daughters who would flee when they knew that the Americans were coming to, quote, liberate a community, versus the Soviets, who Stalin gave an order. In fact, I read his orders on the day that the first troops went to the front, that there would be no sexual fraternization with the enemy, with any of the women. And they were under orders, the generals were under orders to execute, and they did, anyone who was ever found to be engaging in rape, for example. Very different attitude than the Americans and the British. So what we see here is Goebbels' propaganda about how the evil they called the Soviets made these people trust the Americans. And that was a massive mistake. I want to also share with you, speaking of the British, it's just something that came to mind. There was another incident, just complete evil, burning and bombing and sinking of 3 ships carrying Soviet prisoners of war that Germany had caught. And they were being transported to another country. It was nearing the end of the war. And the British bombed and sank, I think they say, approximately 12,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and the Germans on the ships died. They were out there. They had notified the Red Cross, apparently, that they were going to be there. They had the white flag raised, and everyone came on deck with their white shirts. And those who survived, I've read their testimonials. I've listened to their testimonials. They said those British pilots saw them. They knew what this was. This was nothing in the military, and they killed all of them. So the mistreatment of prisoners of war, those are just 2 disgusting and evil, but just 2 of many of the atrocities. And so I just find it the great irony that most people think of atrocities, they start to blame the Soviets. Well, the Allies, and most specifically Britain and the United States, were responsible for some of the most horrendous. I will also tell you, we think about the concentration camps, the work camps in Germany. We think about their transport and dying in the trains, all of that evil, the mistreatment and the suffering of these people. The United States did the same thing to the German prisoners of war. And I've read about how they would open up the train carts, and so many of the German prisoners of war had suffocated to death because they put them in there. So again, the United States caused this the good war. They got out of it with very little loss and so much gain. And again, their mistreatment of the prisoners of war proves human life means nothing to them.
Yeah, the bombing of those prisoners on the ship, that kind of reminds me of what happened with the USS Liberty and all
Wow.
that.
Yeah.
You know, I don't these allied powers, which again, we're talking about Soviet Union, England, and the United States. I mean, was that a true alliance? It doesn't even seem like it was. It seems like, yes, they were technically on the same team in World War II, but man, I feel like it was Churchill that was like pulling the strings, or maybe Churchill and FDR. But I mean, was that really a true alliance?
Not at all. You are completely correct. There can be no alliance between good and evil. And in that alliance, because they had a joint enemy at the time in regards to Hitler's aggression, they joined it. But I would definitely put the word alliance in quotation marks, because Stalin's Soviet Union always, I would say, negotiated and communicated with the other 2 allies in good faith. The sincerity there, but he was not met with that. He was betrayed at every turn. So no, there was no alliance. And of course, intelligence sources that the Soviet Union had in Britain at the time was excellent, and they understood what they were dealing with. That is why when the Americans look at it, all my life, I've heard people talk, oh, how bad it was that they had to join with the Soviet Union. They speak as if it was a bad thing. Again, putting Britain and the US on some righteous level. The truth is just the opposite. The Soviets were the ones who did not want the war, and it was the other 2, the British. And I like how you said about them pulling the strings. Yes, Churchill did this, but his strings were being pulled too, as we discussed earlier. But no, there can't be an alliance between good and evil. And in those allied, the good and the righteous on balance is the Soviet Union, and England and Britain were calculating so that they would get the most out of this and give up the least.
Yeah, yeah. Like, did England, and then even more importantly, the United States, I mean, did they really consider Stalin a threat and the Soviet Union a threat? Like, again, even though they're technically both on the Allied side, but did they legitimately fear Stalin at the time and the Soviet Union?
I would tell you what they feared. They did not fear a military threat from the Soviet Union whatsoever. What they feared was, as I shared with you earlier, what they feared was not a military threat, but was the high degree of education. In fact, I have read a lot of the now declassified CIA documents at the time, and I remember, I think it was in maybe 1946, some of the papers I was reading then, in which they referred to the Soviet government as an aggressive government, as a threat of world domination. And once again, what we see is the Soviet Union was doing none of that. But at the time, the biggest colonial power prior to this, was England, and of course the United States in terms of its imperialism. Projection. But when you read those CIA declassified, I actually read where they identified the biggest threat was the educational level that Stalin had brought the people to, and therefore the economic boom that was happening, their agriculture, their industrialization, their rocket technology, their scientific development, but not in a military threat kind of way, as they led the Americans to believe with their nonsense about the Cold War, hide under your desk. All of this was to justify their military spending. Again, it all goes back to money. The United States began the Cold War. I remember, I think it was in Missouri, Churchill was visiting the United States, and it was in 1946 again, and he gave that famous speech in which he first referred to the Soviet Union as a great iron curtain has fallen in Eastern Europe. And I remember to that, Stalin would often give interviews to Western press as well as to European press, and one of the Soviet papers, Pravda, interviewed him right after Churchill's statement that made the world headlines, to refer to the Soviet Union. That was the start of the Cold War. And I remember him being very articulate in his saying Churchill said is a warmonger, and the United States has joined him with this. And what they are saying and what they are beginning is very dangerous. And so, no, they did not fear the Soviet Union. And I say that, to me, it is a fact. When I read the CIA papers, they simply wanted to maintain American hegemony, American might and power at the expense of others. They did not, just as they do not now, want to see whether it was the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation now to be thriving, to have economic, mutually beneficial cooperation with other countries. They do not believe in cooperation and peace. They believe in dominance at the expense of others. So no, there was no reason for the Cold War either. But again, a false development made by the United States for some to profit, again, at the expense of everyone else.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. Wow, that was a lot, but I think you really did clarify it. Here's what I'd love to do. I think we need to do a follow-up to this to really then get into the Cold War, the start of the Cold War, what that was all about, the truth behind it, because I do think from first of all, I think that 1947-48 timeframe was so important, and I think things really changed after that. And then, you talk about like Eisenhower and his parting speech about the military industrial complex, and then going into JFK. And quite frankly, JFK maybe saying, okay, I don't want to be a part of this military industrial complex. We're going to pull out of Vietnam. There's also the parallel things that were going on between JFK and then Israel at the time, and his relationship with David Ben-Gurion, and wanting to make Israel register as a foreign agent, wanting them not to be able to have nuclear weapons and start their nuclear proliferation, which I think has started. So you've got JFK wanting to come out of the Vietnam, you've got the tension with Israel, and then poof, JFK is assassinated. And so both of those problems go away. My point of saying all that is what I'd like to do in a follow-up episode, if you're up to it, is I do want to then get into really this Cold War
Okay.
and talk about all of that, because I know your grasp on the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation is so strong. So I want to talk all about that because again, I said this in our episode that we did together. I honestly think that the Cold War, which went up until 1992, 93, 91, 92, 93, it quote unquote ends. And then all of a sudden, the war on terror starts. And now it went from the Soviets being the big bad wolf and the enemy to the Muslims and the terrorists. And all of a sudden, that became the big bad wolf and
Mhm.
that became the enemy. And that lasted up to 2021. And then we end that, and then all of a sudden, Ukraine, Russia, it's almost like back to Russia being the big bad enemy. And so now with Trump, I don't know. I've been trying to figure out who his big bad enemy is going to be, but I think we should do another episode then that really gets into the Cold War. How's that sound?
Well, that sounds very good to me. I've appreciated the time with you. I just want more than anything for Americans to realize that they have been relentlessly indoctrinated with lying propaganda, both about the Soviet Union, about the Zionist state, about Stalin himself, about Hitler, the lies that are told about Germany and Hitler, the United States, the CIA always lies and has been operating in these countries and the fifth column in these countries. And if we do such a show, we'll talk about just what the CIA plans have been in regards to the United States for their agenda as well. The truth of the matter is, though, and I would like to bring this back to modern day, and we can have such a show, but as of right now, yes, you said the big bad wolf always ends up being Russia. Yes, that's because the United States and no U.S. president has ever relinquished the goal of taking the Soviet Union, weakening it, taking it, and dividing it. And they have plans from the RAND Corporation on the division of Russia. Those plans and the CIA plans go back for decades. They have never stopped wanting to steal. And it's just tragic that Americans think that America is a righteous country. You can love the people of this country, but in terms of the plans and the people you keep putting in there, all of them are warmongers. All of them value the U.S. dollar over human life. It's never been different, and that's tragic.
Okay. All right. Listen, I think I'm going to end on this because that was a slip, but it was such a perfect slip. You said America is a righteous company. And you know what? I think all the people that have benefited and profited and caused all this
Hmm.
is because they have treated America as a company and a
That
corporation
is true.
and not the country that we all love. So anyway, all right, listen, Christine, I really appreciate it. This has been great. I know we're going to get a bunch of questions. Hang on the line. Okay, everybody. Yeah, anything else?
Ray, I'd
Yeah.
like to invite everyone to my website.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It is AmericanOrthodoxChristian.com. Again, that's AmericanOrthodoxChristian.com. And I'd like to invite, since we're discussing World War II, I have a new essay up there that is widely popular, become very popular worldwide, and it is called The True Stalin. I invite your listeners to my website to learn about the true Stalin. And again, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'll absolutely link your website for everybody and your new essay. And I appreciate you sharing that. I know I've been on your website a bunch and I've learned a lot. So, all right, hang on the line, Christine. All right, everybody. Hey, we are continuing down the path of finding the truth, man. This is what this is all about. And honestly, everything is up for discussion. Everything is up for discussion. World War II, World War I, the Vietnam War, everything. So anyway, that's what we're going to keep delivering to you. All right, everybody, call a spade a spade. Definitely the way Christine Lynn does. All right. Talk to you soon.
This episode was brought to you by the new book Deep Shallow Dive Into You, available now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble in hardcover and paperback. Don't forget to sign up for our new mailing list on our website at deepshallowdive.com.